Welcome to our program, A Conversation with Octavio Paz. I'm your host and moderator, Francisco Lomelí from the University of California at Santa Barbara. I'm especially pleased and honored to have with us as our guest a writer of the stature of Octavio Paz. Welcome, Mr. Paz, to our university. The format of this discussion will be to have a distinguished panel ask a series of questions with follow-ups, and we will go for as long as time permits. But first, allow me to provide a few brief words on our guest. Born in Mexico City in 1914, Mr. Paz is considered to be the most widely acclaimed poet and essayist writing in the Spanish language as of today. He is also a philosopher and has been an ambassador in India. He is regarded as a leading world-recognized intellectual. And he's also a major world figure of letters, having received the Premio Cervantes, certainly seen as the most important in the Spanish language, in 1981. He received the Neustadt Prize, the Premio Nacional de Literatura of Mexico in 1982, and the Jerusalem Prize in 1977, and many other distinctions. Mr. Paz's reputation is not only based on productivity of over 20 books of prose and over 20 books of poetry, but also on his clarity, his lucidity, and on his revolutionizing of language and his personal dialogue and response to his times through his works. Among his landmark works are The Labyrinth of Solitude from 1950 and El Arco y la Lira, The Bow and the Lyre from 1956. Everything Mr. Paz writes impacts the Spanish-speaking world immediately. We welcome Mr. Paz to our university, and we also welcome the distinguished members of the panel who will be addressing questions to Mr. Paz. We have first Alan Phillips, Professor Emeritus from the University of California at Santa Barbara, who is an authority on poetry, particularly by Mexicans and Latin Americans. Secondly, we have Professor Margarita Nieto, an assistant professor from the Cal State University at Northridge, who has done extensive work both on Latin American poetry and prose. And thirdly, we have Luis Leal, Professor Emeritus from the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, who is an expert on Mexican culture and literature. Again, welcome to our program, and we will begin the questions with Professor Phillips.
Mr. Paz, in 1966, you and your fellow editors published Poesía en Movimiento, an anthology which represents Mexican poetry from José Juan Tablada to Arichis and Pacheco, although the chronological order is purposely inverted. My question to you is as follows, and it is a two-part one, which can, of course, be answered in any fashion which you choose. Is it possible to differentiate any poetic currents or trends in the most recent Mexican poetry of the last 10 years or so? And in general terms, how do you feel about Mexican poetry of today, its present and its future?
Well, it's rather complicated, your question, or your two questions. Perhaps I will answer first the second question, and then then I will speak a little about the new trends in Mexican poetry today. Well, I think the tradition of Mexican poetry is one of the longest in the continent. It started in Spanish in the 16th century, and we have had always a reasonable group of good poets all over in our history. But in modern times, Mexican poetry has been especially rich and diverse. We have had successive waves of avant-garde or new trends since the beginning of the century. But in the last 15 years, I don't think that there is nothing new in this sense. But I should say that it's the same in the United States or in England or in France. I think we are now in a period of literary history where the avant-garde movements are extinguished or decadent. That's why we have so much talk in literary circles about the end of modernity, and we are talking everybody's talking about post-modernity. In some way, it's true, postmodernity means the end of some idea of modern art, but not the end of art. I think in this moment, the young Mexican poets are rather interesting, are very good. I should say even that is one, if there is something alive in this moment in Mexico, it's poetry. It's written by young people. But this poetry written by young people is not, it's a great difference with my own youth. It was not a poetry who wanted to be different of the recent poetry. It is not, on the contrary, it's rather traditional, a continuation of the trends that have been that have been inspiring Mexican poetry in the last 15 years.
Do you have a follow-up question to that?
No, I think Mr. Paz answered exactly.
This is the thing I
told
do
me
very
exactly what I wanted to know.
I should add that Mexican poetry is not only alive, young Mexican poetry, but perhaps is one of the best in our language. I don't find in many other countries such a richness and variety of poets as in Mexico.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that, and thank you very much for answering so well a question which I know is complicated.
We will hear names one day. I am quite sure that there are young poets that I really admire, I love, and I don't want to mention any of them because I don't want to be unjust with some others.
Margarita Nieto.
Thank you. Solitude is a mainstay of your work, I would say, beginning with the Labyrinth of Solitude, continuing in many of your poems. There's often the presence of a persona who is seeking communion or seeking solace from a state of solitude. Could you discuss this concept of solitude, its extreme trajectory, alienation, and its corresponding opposite, communion, a bit?
Yes. Well, you know, alienation in some way is a different concept, no? Alienation is a concept who came from two different trends, two different traditions. First, from medicine, psychiatry. Alienated is a crazy person, a man who is not he is not the owner of his own self in some way, no? And then the Hegelian Marxist tradition that alienation is in some way the kidnapping, to talk in a not very exact way, taking out the soul by social forces or historical forces, and the deprivation, interior deprivation. Solitude, I think, is rather different. Solitude is not alienation. Solitude is the emotion or the feeling that you are alone, but you are alone, but not because you lack something in yourself, but you lack something outside yourself. It's a feeling of lack of relationship, perhaps, no? So that's rather different for me. Now, I think solitude, alienation, is a perhaps is a modern phenomenon, but solitude also. Solitude is very popular, I should say, in our civilization. Our mass civilization also is a civilization of solitary people, and perhaps we are solitary because we don't have communion. Now, communion signifies rights, many forms of communication with ourselves or with the other self, with the divine, for instance, and our civilization has eroded all these breaches of communication with the others, and that's why I think our civilization is a civilization of mass and solitary people. I don't know if I have answered your question very clearly, but
Brilliantly. I would love to continue. May I?
You're allowed to have a
Yes.
follow-up question, yes.
yes.
I was going to mention this idea of the bridge. Is this, therefore, the concept of the otherness that you mentioned
Yes.
in terms of your work?
No, the bridge in this moment occurred to me. No, otherness is rather different. Otherness is in some way the answer to to alienation. Alienation is a lack of something. Otherness is when you transcend yourself and go beyond yourself. This is otherness for me. Sometimes this is otherness in yourself, but also the notion of otherness has to do with communion in some way, because the other, by definition, is not only our human being, but God or divinity.
Thank you.
Professor Luis Leal?
So I don't think that there is a writer that has contributed more to make Mexico its culture known outside of the country. And I would like to ask you, in your opinion, what do you think are the most important contributions that Mexico has made in art and letters to the world?
Well, there are two questions, art and letters. Well, art is not so difficult to answer, because it's very clear for me. Well, the first great contribution of Mexico, if it's Mexican contribution, is pre-Columbian architecture and pre-Columbian sculpture. That is one of the most important things, and it's one of the great things of this continent of America, and that is perhaps the most important contribution. Secondly, we have the very beautiful Baroque architecture of Mexico in the 17th and 18th century, and that also I think that has world value. And the Mexican Baroque is not inferior to the Baroque, to the European Baroque. And it's extraordinary to see how the Baroque goes from Goa in India, then to Latin America, to Mexico, to Ecuador, to Peru, and then to Spain, to Germany, to Austria, etc. No? And in this great constellation of great Baroque art, Mexican Baroque has a distinguished place. This should be too important in art. Then I should say that there is a minor, but not so minor, a minor painter called Bustos, who made portraits. And I think he's one of the most distinguished painters of portraits in the 19th century. Not in Mexico, in America, and perhaps in the world. He's a little master. You say little master in English, is a small master, un petit maître in French, no? But he's a very good painter. Then you have another great artist, very original artist, because he's one of the founders, in some way, of the black humor in modern times, Posada. And Posada had an enormous influence. When Breton was in Mexico, he was very much impressed by Posada, and you cannot understand well Mexican painting without Posada. Then this is a very good an example of good painting. Finally, I think the muralists, the great muralists are important in the history of modern art. Yeah, they are important in two aspects, by themselves and by the influence that they had there on American painting. Pollock, Noguchi, Louis Nevelson, I don't know how many, almost all the important artists of the United States, in one moment or other of their youth, had some influence of the Mexican muralists. And among the Mexican muralists, I admire especially one of them, Orozco. I think he's one of the great expressionists of the 20th century. Finally, and we have, not finally because he's still alive, but this is Tamayo. Tamayo, I think, is one of the great contributions of Mexico to modern, to 20th century art. He's one of our best painters, one of the best painters of the American continent, and that could be the least in art. Now, in literature, it's more complicated, because Mexican literature is not isolated from Spanish-speaking literature. It's very difficult to say this is Mexican and this is Argentinian and this is Spanish. No? Mexican literature is part of Latin American literature, and Latin American literature is part of the Portuguese and the Spanish literature. That's difficult, but I will try to answer again. First, I think Aztec Nahuatl poetry is very original and very powerful. Secondly, we have Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I think is one of the great, I think the great poetess of America is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I am sorry to say that because I admire very much Emily Dickinson, and I admire Elizabeth Bishop, and I admire Marianne Moore, or in South America I admire very much Gabriela Mistral. But I think the most complete poet in this continent was Sor Juana. Sor Juana was a great poet and also a great mind, a good playwright and a good philosopher. It was a universal mind. Then it's very interesting that in this is a kind of punition, or God punition, divine punition, that a woman should be the best writer of a tierra de machos as Mexico. that is one of the
ironies. One of the grand ironies.
The great ironies. I think it's one great writer. Yes. And then in the 20th century we had some novelists, all these novelists of the Revolution. Now everybody's talking about Latin American novel. I admire Latin American novel, but Latin American novel is a recent phenomenon. It started before, and before the great names of contemporary Latin America novel, there were some novelists that are very important, as Azuela, who was in his moment famous even in the United States and in Europe, and Martinez Guzman and some others. I think this, and then we have a writer almost unknown in the United States, and I think he's a great writer, one of the great writers of our continent, and who has written the most interesting memoirs in Jose Vasconcelos. I am a great reader of memoirs. I was educated with the education of Henry Adams. It's one of my favorite books. Well, a parallel, and a very instructive parallel, because it's a contradictory parallel with the education of Henry Adams, should be Ulises Criollo of Jose Vasconcelos. I think it's a great book, and I hope one day will be translated into English and will be read in English.
Well, you have answered my question very well, but I noticed one omission.
Oh, that's good.
Your own.
No.
Which I believe have been very important, especially the Labyrinth of Solitude. We cannot read anything about Mexico without finding a reference to your book. Now, I want to ask you a related question. In your own development as a writer and a poet, what has been the influence of the American writers, the North American writers?
It has been a great influence. I think it has been the second influence. The first has been perhaps the French in the beginning, but then the American writers. I should say that as all the adolescents, I read when I was very young first, being a Spanish American and influenced by all the literature around him. Edgar Allan Poe, I was reading all the short stories. I loved them. I could not understand why the English and the Americans didn't like so much the poet. I loved the poet, but then I understood little by little how wrong was Baudelaire and how wrong was Mallarmé, admiring Edgar Allan Poe as a great poet. He is an interesting poet, but he's not a great poet. But he's a great prose writer. That is the important thing, and also a theoretical mind. And then my great discovery, perhaps, was Whitman. I think Whitman has been the great fountain of poetry in this continent. I think it's and then, of course, as all this overwhelming influence sometimes has been very bad, I think for me was good. But thinking in other poets, for instance, Neruda, I think Neruda sometimes was damaged because he wanted to be something very dangerous, a South American Whitman. And that I think is not the best thing to be. No? That's enough with one Whitman. We don't need more Whitman. But Whitman was the great discovery and it was a good discovery for me because I read Whitman, and almost at the same time I started to read modern poetry, modern American poetry, and I read especially Eliot. And Eliot was a very important influence in my own development. First, as a critical mind, I learned how to be aware of the dangers of Whitmanism, thanks to Eliot, for instance, and then as a poet, this trying to link myth, history, very intellectual reflections with also colloquial language. All this for me was very important. For me, was very important American poetry, not only Eliot, but all the American poets, because I learned in them how to use colloquial poetry, colloquial language, everyday language. I remember this essay by Eliot: "Poetry is the music of poetry is the music of conversation." Well, that is, I think, is rather deep and rather important for a poet. Then I read William Carlos Williams. I have translated William Carlos Williams. I admire him very much, and I had the chance to meet him. I met also Cummings. I have some letters by Cummings, and I was. And then at the end of his life, I met Ezra Pound in Italy, a poet that I admire very much. I have translated one canto and some other texts by Eliot. I have studied him, by Pound. I have studied him. I think the influence of American poetry has been very important for me. And the first contribution was perhaps the use of colloquial language. The second one was how to write long poems. After all, the Spanish and the French tradition, modern, is strong in short poems, not long poems. Or well, long poems in a very artificial way, as Valéry Le Cimetière Marat. But with the wasteland, with the cantos, I learned how to treat contemporary matter with the classical nature of the long poem, and that was for me a great thing.
Given the fact that we have very little time, if you have any questions, panel members, but it has to be a brief question, beginning with Alan Phillips.
Well, you talked about writing long poems, and I referred to you not only as a great poet, but an author of great poems. When I say great poems, I also mean long poems.
Long poems.
But you also have a talent for writing very small poems. In other words, would you care to comment upon the Japanese haiku, for example, which would be perhaps to me the opposite of a long Whitman-like poet or a long Eliot poem?
Well, you know, the haiku for me is linked again with the United States because the first who introduced the haiku, as you know very well, was a Mexican poet, Tablada, more or less at the same time, little later than Pound was writing. Tablada started to write haiku. But I didn't pay, when I was young, too much attention to Tablada. And in 1945, when I was in New York, Tablada died, and I was asked to write something on him. And then I went to the library of New York Library. I found all the books by Tablada. I discovered Tablada, and I discovered the haiku. And the next step was to start to read first Japanese poetry and then Chinese poetry. And then it has been for me a great, very important, of course, because it has been a example of concentration. I admire very much poetry, short poems, who are very powerful enough to contain a word in a grain of sand, as William Blake said. No? In this sense, I should remember, since we are in Santa Barbara, a American poet who was a good friend of mine and who I admire him, Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth Rexroth not only was a very original poet, especially a love poet, a nature poet, but also a great translator. His translations of the French, especially of Pierre Reverdy, are marvelous, but also his translation of Japanese and Chinese poetry were very important for me, at least. I read his translations, and the moment I was very much interested in Chinese and Japanese poetry, in Oriental poetry.
May I add that you say you discovered tablada, but let's also say that you discovered tablada for all of us. In other words, we discovered tablada because you did it first.
Well, yes, I had a chance, that is true, and I am proud of this small discovery. I am proud that I was one of the first to talk about tablada, who was totally forgotten, and was the first to who introduced in Spanish the haiku. Even in Spain, they don't pay even now too much attention to him, no?
I think there's no doubt that you've been a trailblazer in many aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I don't know if any of you members have a very quick question.
Well,
We only have about 30 seconds.
Perhaps a brief commentary on the relationship
yes.
between the longer poem, the influence, which I think is obvious. It speaks of your importance to contemporary poet, the relationship between Pound, Eliot, and yourself, but perhaps also the relationship between Garcilaso and your work.
Garcilaso de la Vega? Not, I don't see it.
You don't
Perhaps,
see any relationship?
no. It's not the, I admire him, but it's not the, no.
No relationship at all.
I don't, well, perhaps yes. All of us, all of the people who speak, who write in Spanish, in some way we are related with Garcilaso, no? As everybody in English is related with Spencer, no? But I am not.
You don't feel any.
No, I don't. I prefer some other poets of the 17th century than Garcilaso. I love him, but that's all. No?
It's very obvious that we could continue. I'm very sorry, but we have run out of time. I want to again give my sincerest appreciation to the panel members. Of course, my special thanks to our guest, Octavio Paz. This is your host, Francisco Lomelí, in our program, A Conversation with Octavio Paz in Santa Barbara, California.
a great many other known examples, and perhaps some whose venomous nature is still unrecognized. In only a few instances have the chemical nature and biological actions of substances present in these venoms been studied, and such research should lead to discoveries of considerable scientific and medical importance. At certain research centers, studies on the nature and actions of these venoms are now in progress. Animals are often shipped alive to the laboratory and maintained in seawater aquaria until used, as was the case here at the University of Southern California with this venomous cone shell captured in Guam. Extracts of the venom are prepared and subjected to chemical and pharmacological studies. One technique for investigating such actions involves the use of the isolated rabbit heart, which will continue to beat spontaneously for long periods of